Now we're going to do a little pressing, and then we'll sew the inseam. So you could clip here, but I actually don't think it's necessary. So we've got the seam allowance and the pocket going towards the front. See, the shorter, less shallow, without a notch, rise is the front. So I'm just going to go ahead and give everything a press now. Pocket going towards the front. Pocket should go towards the front because that's where our hand is going to go in that pocket. And I'm going to turn this over in a minute after I give it a good press and show you how pretty that discreet inseam pocket is. It's a nice pocket detail, or nice type of pocket. Very functional. So anyways, you can see I'm pushing. There's no rule that the seam allowance needs to be pressed towards the front or the back. There really isn't a rule to that. And since I'm pushing the seam allowance, often in intermediate sewing, we clip and then we press the seam open because it's a dress and we're going to be putting a lining. But for this, it's fine if the seam allowance goes towards the pocket, and then you don't have to do any clipping. Okay, so it's pressed. Let's look at the other side, and then you can see. So this is the pocket coming. Now I hope, but see, I think they had us set the pocket too low, because what would be ideal is if you catch the top of that pocket. See, that's the way the pattern is in the dress. It comes to the waist and it's caught. So this flops around in here, which is not ideal, not what I would improve that if I was making the pattern. Okay, but look how nice this is. See how discreet the pocket is? Your hand goes in, and the seam is hidden underneath there because we took a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're ready to put the inseams together. And this is where students often get confused, and we don't want you to get confused, so we're going to explain this right now, that students get confused because this isn't the same width. You actually have to move this over to and make it match, because our front is less wide than our back, and that's why this piece is not as wide. The front is not as wide as back. So anyways, move it over and then start to line up your seam allowance. Now you'll notice why didn't I push that all the way to the top? Because I'm matching it up at the sew line. Our sew line is 5/8 of an inch. That's our seam allowance. So that's where, that's where I match and start to pin my inseam. So this is the inseam of the pant. We've sewn the out seam or the side seam. And again, just try to keep it smooth, walk it down, and pin, every 5 inches or so should be acceptable. All right, and there's a chance that when you get down to the bottom, again, it could be a little bit uneven. Even mine is a little bit uneven right now. My sew line is perfect though, so it could either be the pinning process or when I adjusted that pattern. It's pretty close though, but yeah, I can trim that up and blend that line when I get ready to hem the pant. Okay, and that's the inseam. So while we're recording, we'll just go ahead. You don't have to see me pin the whole inseam again, but this is what it looks a little different with our home sewing machine with a zigzag. But it's still the same idea. So I'm going to open it up. Wait, I'll flip it over so we can make sure. Okay, and then this is our front. So once again, we want our pocket. See the difference between the overlock and the zigzag? The zigzag actually stretched the fabric just a little bit, even though it's a woven. So, but you can see I'm kind of steaming it back into shape. There I caught that seam allowance. It won't hurt anything, but it was because it was probably underneath when I was coming back around, and so ideally it would have been all the way flat here. So just get in the habit of pressing. Seam, press, seam, press. That is a good practice when sewing. All right, let's look at this side. And see, from the outside, it's just as pretty. It's just not quite as pretty as the overlock on the inside, but it's still very nice. There's our discreet pocket. Our seams are pressed open. Our pocket is pressed. And we are ready to pin the inseam of the other pant leg. Okay. Okay, so I'm at the machine now, and I'm going to stitch the inseam. And again, you want your fabric, the cut edge to the right. So on one side you'll be stitching on the front, the other side you'll be stitching on the back, and that is okay. We just want to make sure that we're lining the seam allowance up with the 5/8 inch mark. And that our edges are lined up properly. And see how I was saying that as you move pins, the machine might, because sometimes you think you have things perfectly flat, but maybe they're not perfectly flat. And this machine also pushes the top layer of fabric a little bit. So it's okay to move the pin and flatten as you go, because you don't want to sew that pucker in. That'll be there forever if you sew a pucker in. And I've got a little bit of a discrepancy right here, 1/4 of an inch at the bottom. So I'll have to trim that when I get ready to hem the pant. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do the home seam finish on this inseam, and then I'll do an overlock on the next one, just so you can see the difference. So back to the zigzag again, stitch B, stitch length 2, stitch width 5. Again, lining up the edge of the fabric with the inside window of our presser foot, right edge. All right, and that gives us a stitch right at the edge of our seam allowance, and that'll keep our fabric from fraying. This one I have checked to make sure all pins are out, because again, you never want to have a pin near an overlock machine. You don't want to hit the pin. And I'll start at the top of the inseam and see how I just run it right on. This is another thing. See, you want to be careful when you're working with an overlock. I mean, there's a chance that some of you do have an overlock, and you don't want to, if you get this bunched up, you could cut your fabric and make a hole in your pant. And it has happened in the classroom several times. My machine was dancing a little bit there. Okay, so I have a sleeve board, and it's actually a really old sleeve board. So they look a little different now if you buy them in the store. Now, I realize that you may not have a sleeve board. You may have a narrow, an ironing board that's narrow enough to do this next technique though. But we thought we'll show you if you have the proper sewing tools, this is how they're used, because it's good to know, proper sewing tools. And then if not, how you can make do. So, but if you had a sleeve board or a narrow ironing board, you can pull the leg, because now we're pressing the inseam. We want to press the inseam flat. Now, again, there's no right or wrong, but typically you press a seam towards the back. It was a little bit different on the pocket because the pocket seam had to go towards the front. But again, there's no right or wrong rule, set in stone that you have to press a seam a certain direction when it comes to a side seam. But typically they're pressed towards the back. All right, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just pressing the seam towards the back. And I can turn it right side out even and go ahead and look at my seam and maybe even hit it again, because this is a great opportunity to be able to get in and really press those seams before you put both pant legs together. And see how nice that looks. Press open and clean. Okay, now if you don't have a narrow ironing board or a sleeve board, what you'll do is put it on your ironing board or ironing mat, whatever you happen to be using at home. Okay, so if you are working on a flat surface, and as a matter of fact, I meant to mention this because I was talking with one of my students on Zoom last night, and I was telling him, and he pulled this board out. These are not terribly expensive, and boy, are they handy. You can press anywhere if you don't have an ironing board, or because the student was working on the floor. Well, you can press on the floor with a board like this. So it's called a cushion quilter's square and blocker. It's really a quilting tool, but oh my gosh, I bought one of these a while ago, and I use it way more than I ever use my ironing board. They're about $30 at Joann Fabric, and you can probably find them other places. But remember, when you see those 50% off coupons at Joann's, this is an item that doesn't go on sale very much, so you may be able to use one of those 50 or 60% off coupons. Anyways, so I have the pant laid flat, and now I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the back. So I'm looking, there's my double notch, so now I know I'm pressing towards the back. So just like I did a minute ago on the sleeve board, I'm just pressing, but you do have to kind of flatten it out to be able to do this well. So rather than press the seam open, we're pressing the seam towards one side, and that is towards the back. All right, so now I'm going to go on to the next step, and I'm not going to turn this one inside out. I can see that it's pressed well, and I'm ready to do the next step, which is my favorite part of sewing a pant. Okay, so we've got the one pant leg. I turned right side out, and I gave it another little press, and you saw me do that. But this one I'm going to leave wrong side out, because the next step is to put the rise together. And this is a really cool, I think it's a really cool part of putting a pant together. This is the way so you're going to notice that in the pattern instructions, one pattern shows you this way, the other pattern shows you a different way. We're going to make a PowerPoint that goes over the step by step so that you can see what to do. This is, in my opinion, this is the right way to do it. This is the way it's done in the fashion industry, because you get a better fitting rise and you don't end up with a bunch of stuff in the crotch area. All right, so what you're going to do is take the pant that you have turned right side out. You're going to put your arm inside that pant leg, and you're going to make sure that the inseam that we just pressed and sewed is on the top of your arm. Now you're going to match the inseam to this inseam. So you're going to tuck your arm down inside there, pushing the pant all the way down in. And then you're going to start to line up the rise. It's going to make a U shape, like the rise of the pant and the way it goes around your body. And it'll take a little finagling and fanoodling. But anyways, that's what, so you're going to be watching for those notches. Now on this pant, it has the double notch. You want those to match up, put a pin. And you want that inseam, so you can, and that might be the easiest to pin the inseam first because we pushed our pant inside there, and you can look at find your inseam right away. And then what I do at the inseam, I make sure it's lined up, and I typically push one seam allowance one way and one the other, and it just reduces so that there's no bulk in your crotch because nobody wants bulk there. Anyways, so then go ahead and keep pinning around that curve. And if you sewed everything correctly and you sewed one right leg and one left leg, these curves should just match beautifully. And so now I'm pinning the front of the pant. And I had already pinned the back, and we're ready to sew the rise of the pant. And you are getting pretty close to having a pajama pant right now. Okay, so when you've got it pinned correctly, it will look like that. You'll see a U shape. If your rise doesn't line up like this, if it doesn't go together, you may have sewn two front legs together or two back legs together. And so don't do that. Just don't do that. Because you have to tear it all out or recut at that point because you've got a lot of zigzag and stuff, so it's going to be really hard to be a lot of practice with the seam ripper though, but that's what would have gone wrong. If you were careful and you put the right front leg to the back when you sewed your inseam and your outseam, then it'll go together just like this. Okay, now we're going to sew this U shape. And to tell you the truth, it doesn't matter if you start at the front or the back. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead, I'll start the fronts right here. So again, this is the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Back stitch. Put that over there. Okay, there's nothing really tricky about this. If you just are careful, the only thing that's going to feel different to you at this point is that you have a lot of fabric here to move around because the apron pieces were much smaller. But you're just sewing along the edge, so there's nothing, difficult or tricky. And just sewing around the curve, so just gently guiding around the curve. And then I've come to the rise where I've pushed one seam towards the one side and one towards the other to reduce bulk. And so now I'm sewing over that inseam. Oh, there's my double notch lined up perfectly. And again, I believe on this pant, there's no notch on the front, but I believe on the other pattern, there's a single notch on the front and the double notch on the back. Back stitch when you get to the top of the waist, and that is that. Now, overlock or finish. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and zigzag. Since we're right here, we're just, we have to have a seam finish on all of our seams. So I'm going back to the B stitch. I pulled this needle up out of the machine, so I didn't get that knot again like I just did it a minute ago. Stitch length on 2, back to 5. Got my right edge of my fabric in the window lined up with the little opening in the window of the presser foot. Just manipulating the fabric so I can continue around the curve. Again, nothing tricky or difficult, just sewing around a curve. not really necessary to backstitch, but it's just a habit on the zigzag. And that's that. That's the rise of the pant, and now we're ready to do our waist elastic and our hem.